Do you remember the two processing systems from the previous video? I'll show you the byproduct of the first system so you can see what we are up to. You just saw one of the billions of emotional notation underlying human behavior generated by the unconscious. And each notation has a message to deliver about the environment that frames a particular time. And in this video, I'll show you how the message is encrypted. Human behavior happens in 3 stages: the assessment, analysis, and execution. The assessment, the first stage, runs by the unconscious and includes a series of scanning processes. In the scanning, we're in receptor mode and mostly receive sensory inputs related to the current situation from the environment. But let me define you the nature of the unconscious first so you can understand why the series of scanning is required. Unconscious is mute, speaks no words. It's rapid, reflexive, automated, and highly responsive to change. The nature of the unconscious is the most critical part, should be remembered throughout this process because these are the pillars of human behavior. The unconscious is unconscious, involuntary, and speaks no words. Since the unconscious is mute, the senses are the only way for the unconscious to build a replica, a model of the current environment, to share the information with the second system known as the conscious. Let me demonstrate it frame by frame so you can see how the unconscious links sensory inputs with emotions to create the first code of a notation for a particular time. Imagine walking on the streets and scanning the environment for sensory inputs. Then the unconscious matches these external inputs with the internal memory hub to look for a possible match or a stressor. Now the unconscious has to convert its assessment process into an emotional code to determine our state for a certain duration. So it can send this memory block to the memory hub to recall it in the future. Each emotional code contains 3 pieces of information to analyze by the conscious for a particular period of time: the presence of a stressor or proximity to the stressor, and our capacity to handle the stressor. Once the unconscious pitches the information before the conscious, in our example, the emotional code is joy, and the conscious decodes the assessment as there is no stressor and nothing to be proximate about, so your capacity is explore. The conscious analyzes the assessment by matching it with existing models before turning them into a choice. And that brings us to the last and the third stage of behavior, which is execution. So the execution stage comes with an element of choice. It is up to the conscious to follow the assessment or not. As we experienced in the previous video, we are gigantic receptors and we use emotional notation to determine our position in any given situation. We receive sensory inputs from the environment and match them with our internal memory hub to look for a possible match or a stressor. Suppose this is your memory cluster from the previous video. We convert this memory cluster and all the inputs related to that sequence into an emotional code so this information can move quickly to the higher system or systems. In this case, our emotional code is joy. And because once you lock them together as a cluster, all the inputs related to that sequence can trigger each other, such as an emotion can bring up a smell, or the smell can build up entire environment from the past. This process takes place in the amygdala complex, the part of the limbic system in the human brain. The amygdala generates 5 primary emotions to activate the autonomic nervous system. The responses are anger to fight, fear to flight, sadness to freeze, anxiety to fun, and joy to relieve or explore. However, these reflexes are not absolute, and they are subject to updating because each emotional code contains 3 pieces of information: the presence of a stressor, your proximity to the stressor, and your capacity to handle the stressor. Feeling 4 primary emotions already signals to brain. These are fear, anger, sadness, and anxiety. Signals to brain there is a stressor. The intensity of emotion tells your proximity to the stressor, when the kind of the emotion tells your capacity to handle the stressor. So it wouldn't be wrong to say that human behavior is a sum of these emotional codes played in different frequencies and duration throughout the day. And so it's normal to get sometimes a harmonious, sometimes discordant notation, and depending on your living condition. Your unique notation produces by the limbic and autonomic nervous system axis, I'll use ANS for short, and plays out in the background of your behaviors. Sometimes sad, sometimes happy, sometimes infuriating, sometimes scary, but it can only show, cannot tell. Because this axis is the counterpart of the unconscious. Don't worry, I won't get down to the nitty-gritty of the human nervous system. Instead, I suggest you watch Dr. Erich Huberman to explore more on the subject. He discusses neuroscience and science-based tools on his channel. But for now, let me introduce you to each party located on the axis so you can see the quiet chemistry behind show, don't tell process. The limbic and autonomic nervous systems are the producers at both ends. And the actors from the limbic end are the amygdala complex, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and pituitary gland, and the actors from the ANS are the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The autonomic nervous systems uses these 2 subsystems to balance out human behavior. I'll get there later, but let's go back to the limbic end. So you already met with the amygdala complex. The one processes sensory inputs and memories coming from hippocampus, what we call the memory hub. Hippocampus stores all sort of memories, but only keep those in use and fades away the unused. Autonomic nervous system balances out your behaviors by tilting these 2 subsystems from one side to another. It ramps up your alertness rather than calmness if the new information requires immediate action. The first subsystem, the sympathetic nervous system, has everything to do with increasing alertness for mobilization. And the second subsystem, parasympathetic nervous system, is about being calm and conserving energy for immobilization. Once the amygdala generates a threat reflex, it activates all neural circuits related to high levels of alertness and then shuts off all the circuits associated with being calm and seeing the big picture. Mobilization completes in 2 pathways, with a short-term rapid startle impulse produced by the sympathetic adrenal medullary system and a long-term stress response produced by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis for short. There are two adrenal glands, one on top of each kidney. The outer layer of each gland is adrenal cortex, and the inner layer is adrenal medulla. Both produce and secrete hormones into the system. So in the short-term response, the sympathetic adrenal medullary system quickly activates the adrenal medulla to generate rapid adrenaline rush to the stressor. It happens within 100 milliseconds and creates physiological arousal to produce the fight or flight response. But if this quick rush or quick attempt, let's say, doesn't solve the stress or problem, the long-term stress response takes over. The HPA axis is a three-part system that consists of the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenals. The hypothalamus balances the autonomic nervous system by managing chemical signals like neurotransmitters and hormones. It signals the pituitary gland, which is located just below hypothalamus, to trigger the adrenal cortex to release chemical signals into the system like cortisol and adrenaline. The activation of the HPA axis requires a long-term recurrent stressor. So it doesn't happen very quickly because releasing cortisol into the system takes minutes rather than seconds. And it is slower to take effect. But what if none of these chemicals resolve the stress? The parasympathetic nervous system comes to rescue. Immobilization happens when there is no energy to run the system, so it signals the brain to freeze. And you experience this freeze response as changing your cognitive functions and dissociation, like a flood of tears, or you might say intense sadness. Being exposed to these long-lasting chemicals in long duration and high frequency can change not only the connections in the brain, but also gene expression. Let's recap the recent show Don't Tell process together. First, mobilization tried to resolve the stressor with short and long-term responses, but none of these solved the problem, and immobilization took over. While all this was happening, another system was always in the background to numb us against pain. The periaqueductal gray, the PAG in short, is an ancient analgesic brain structure at the top of the brain stem. It communicates with the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems to regulate confrontation, escape, and immobilization. So finally, this show, Don't Tell process, ends with a cameo, the dopamine system, which is responsible for reward and motivation reinforcement. Your brain reads all these electrical pulses and chemical signals to model your version of the world. The unconscious constantly processes external and internal inputs to create memory clusters for each situation. The unconscious updates your capacity whenever a change occurs, and it must complete this process before sending each cluster to the hippocampus. At this point, it is crucial to understand the difference between the automated unconscious and the cognitive conscious, what we call the neocortex. The unconscious has a self-perpetuating structure that cannot speak, but communicates through emotional notation. The speaking part, on the other hand, belongs to the conscious, which is cognitive and slow. But I think our ancestors planted the seeds of the humanity's fundamental problem right at that junction. I'll talk about it in the following video.